It wasn't going to be difficult for 2021 to seem better in some fairly significant ways than 2020, but to be fair, it did start off in a pretty tumultuous fashion with attempts to overthrow the election that had just concluded a couple of months before, and hell breaking loose in a number of different state legislatures, with many Republicans at the state level responding to the national election losses by striking back against the new wave of voting. And out there, the movement that was defeated in the general election hasn't gone away and might be biding its time for the next election. So there's a lot going on, and I've been looking forward to taking stock with an individual that we last spoke to right in the aftermath of the 6th, actually. So we're very lucky to be joined once again by the Jacob Borowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University, Jason Stanley. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks, it's great to be back.
Very glad to have you here. I know you've been hard at work on your book, but a lot has been going on, and I've been curious, considering the conversations we've had over the past few years about American fascism, about political rhetoric. What are some of your thoughts about what's been going on recently across America?
I hate to be the sort of Holocaust survivor's kid and always say I'm deeply worried, but I am profoundly worried. I think what we're seeing right now, I saw a great tweet about this. I tweeted, the United States is going in the direction of Hungary. And I saw someone tweet, that's not true. The United States is going in the direction of the European Union, where certain states are gonna be like Poland and Hungary, no more democracy, bans on anything leftist in universities, free, complete one-party states run by the Republican juggernaut, conservative judges. This is familiar from the authoritarian countries in the EU of Hungary and Poland. And then you're gonna have states like Connecticut, who pretty much are, functioning in reasonable ways, given late stage capitalism. So I think that's a good way to think about it. We're seeing many states. I mean, Florida's law to illegalize against rebellions and protests. I mean, I think rebellion is a good name. My colleague Elizabeth Hinton talks about this. Instead of protest and riot, which creates a kind of mistaken dichotomy. Oh, it's a protest unless someone throws a can, in which case it's a terrible riot, which is like, if you're trapped in that, you're doing something nonsensical. So Elizabeth Hinton's new book, America on Fire, she says, if you look at Black Lives Matter and you look back at the long history, at the rhetoric, at the political rhetoric, at what the police were saying about what was going on, they're political rebellions. And political rebellions often involve violence. So, what we're having is essentially authoritarian Russia-style laws being employed against protest. We're seeing Florida. We're seeing the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, get her powers taken away. We're seeing all across the country Jim Crow style. I mean, I wouldn't really call them Jim Crow style, because they're more influenced by Hungary. They're more influenced by the European authoritarian states, but they harken back to our Jim Crow past. And then finally, we're seeing, in a kind of eternal recurrence, we're seeing patriotic education. We're seeing the thing that W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction rails against. We see people saying, we need patriotic education to bind the country together. And Du Bois in Black Reconstruction says, history isn't about binding people together with lies. History is about telling the truth. Binding people with lies, yes, we can talk about the noble lie, but whitewashing the Confederacy, whitewashing white supremacy, and then is never going to result any good with any good. And also, as Du Bois emphasizes, it's the destruction of truth. And finally, we're seeing this terrible attack. All across the world, you have this attack on this culture war against trans ideology. Each right-wing culture, America is so provincial, if you have an international perspective, you know that each country tries a critical race theory locally. They try like some culture war, and if it doesn't work, they switch to another. So Poland started with immigrants, demonizing immigrants, but then it turned out there are no immigrants in Poland, so they moved to gays. And now it's like super harsh against homosexuality in Poland, terrifying. They're banning gay couples from adopting children. In the United States, all over the world, however, there's transgender ideology. There's this focus on transgender ideology. Because transgender, because as Adam Sawyer points out, the transgender community is small enough, they can't really support themselves. And then of course, because it's the United States, critical race theory. Always, always, always. Critical race theory, whites are under attack. In 1963, 46% of white people said it is just as easy for black and white members of our community to get a job in 1963. Now we're being told structural racism is over. I was like a complete misunderstanding of what structural racism is. So it's this same old theme. It is always the case that Americans want to think racism is, and because they want to think that, they don't do much to end it.
Sure. You raised a lot of points, and I'd like to dive into a few of them. I mean, first of all, I'm curious about your thoughts about the juxtaposition of, you pointed out the striking back against critical race theory. It's literally been banned in some states, including in Florida, at a time when one of the only things conservatives are talking about is how cancel culture is out of control. And even in particular, the publisher of Dr. Seuss books choosing not to publish anymore is a terrible imposition for liberty. They're literally banning a philosophical framework from being discussed. That seems like a few people should take note of the hypocrisy, but so far they seem to have been able to make it work.
The level of hypocrisy is absurd at this point. I mean, with the Supreme Court justice, with so-called cancel culture, what we're seeing with critical race theory, it's just a search and replace with what Eastern Europe did with gender ideology. They banned gender ideology. And since it's America, in addition to gender ideology, because it's America, we have to ban critical race theory. It's not even clear what critical race theory is. What is critical race theory? There are many great black intellectuals, from Martin Delaney, Douglas, Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, to the present day, to Saidiya Hartman, and others, Charles Mills, Patricia L. Collins. These are all theorists working in different perspectives who talk about the fact that there are large racial disparities and there are ideological reasons for large racial disparities. And then what they do is they take this expression, meaningless expression, that is connected, because critical race theory, I mean, being critical about ideology does connect to Marx, because Marx wrote the German ideology, which is about the ideology of capitalism. And so they're like, oh, it's all criticizing ideology. So it's this kind of nonsensical, and then the Frankfurt School has to be there because they're Jewish people. And so you gotta have some scary Jewish left-wing intellectuals. So, America over and over again, leftist Jews and black radicals, and of course, leftist Jews and black radicals have been among America's greatest intellectuals. And Angela Davis getting demonized when, prison abolition has, whether you agree with it or not, has moved to the very forefront of debate in the ways that few philosophical programs have ever done. And this backlash, it's one of, frankly, the worst things I've seen in a democratic country. I'm disgusted. And of course, the reason it's there is because critical race theory has the number of the Republican parties. Why are they going after critical race theory? Because critical race theory says this is a white supremacist country that refuses to acknowledge its white supremacy. It refuses to acknowledge the discrepancies, structural racism. So they have to go after it. And they're going after gender ideology worldwide because these macho leaders who are destroying country after country are patriarchal and have the worst sins of patriarchy. So they have to go after gender ideology because gender ideology explains that too.
And they're also doing an absolutely horrible job of protecting their countries. Some of the most, as you would point out, self-proclaimed almost macho politicians have the worst death counts internationally. One thing you talk there about.
I just want to pump the preface of my paperback, which was I had to send in to Penguin Random House on March 14th, 2020. And they said, you have to talk about COVID. And I said, COVID hadn't even arrived in Brazil. I said, no one knows who's gonna do badly on COVID. What am I supposed to say? So then I predicted that the 3 worst countries in COVID would be Brazil, the United States, and India, because their leaders were anti-science and fascist. So, I mean, I'm never about, but maybe, just maybe, we need to pay attention to the genocidal downstream aspects of the leaders we elect.
Yeah, and of being so fundamentally anti-science, anti-truth. Like I talked about in the intro, we last spoke in the aftermath of the 6th. And I wonder about the similarity between you saying it's quite natural for them to be against critical race theory because critical race theory sort of asks people to recognize the history and current state of white supremacy in America, and they've sort of whitewashed that. At the same time that over the past few months, the 6th has been largely either ignored or rewritten. Tucker Carlson still does shows implying that there was no white supremacy there. It was perfectly fine. Those are good citizens, good patriots. And I don't know that in the immediate aftermath of it, I would have predicted that, seeing that footage, that they would risk trying to stand on the side of those insurrectionists, let alone that they would succeed in doing so. And the wider attempts to overthrow the election have been largely whitewashed as well. Trump just in the last day put out a statement saying that the election itself was the big lie, not his efforts to overthrow it. So there's a lot that they're choosing not to recognize over the past few months.
So January 6th, I mean, in a country that whitewashed torture, the massive torture regime, that whitewashed the genocidal Iraq war, that whitewashed the massively horrific financial crisis, that's whitewashed what I've called in print Trumpian genocide, and especially Bolsonaro's genocide with COVID. I'm not surprised they'd whitewash January 6th. I mean, and when we look at the people in January 6th, I think of Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz. Myself, I'm Ted Cruz's age. I'm a normal guy from Syracuse. I went to SUNY Binghamton while this dude was at Princeton and all the fanciest places in the world, competing, winning every debate prize. He was the elite of the elite of the elite. I became a philosophy professor because I wrote a bunch of books that made hits, but he was the elite of the elite of the elite, and he's leading an anti-democratic, quasi-fascist coup. So, the failures here. The failures start at the top, and the failure of the Republican Party, Democratic and Republican Party both flirted deeply with white supremacy. The 90s was a massive disaster for anti-black racism in the Democratic Party, but with super predator theory at all. But the Republican Party has become an anti-democratic party. They've become an explicitly anti-democratic party. On every political science measure, they're an extreme far-right European party. But they're not just an extreme far-right European party on abortion, on taxes, on health, on gun control, on climate change, where they're the only major conservative party to deny climate change. They are an anti-democratic party.
Yeah. Fundamentally, we're seeing that play out in states around the country.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.